Welcome to Command Control Power, a weekly podcast hosted by 3 certified members of the Apple Consultants Network, drawing from over half a century of combined experience. We talk shop, interview vendors and colleagues, and share what we've learned while operating our technology consulting practices. This is Joe Saponare of CyMac, and my 2 co-hosts are Jerry Zigmont of MacWorks and Sam Valencia of the HCS Technology Group. Hey everybody, it's our 9th anniversary. That's right, we've been recording Command Control Power every week since June 2013. For the freshest content, a peek behind the scenes, and more candid conversation about running our businesses, dealing with clients, fixing tough technical issues, and everything else you love about Command Control Power, we invite you to join us on Patreon so you don't miss any of this great content. Go to commandcontrolpower.com and click support. Pledge monthly, and you can instantly subscribe to the weekly patron-only shows right in your favorite podcast app.
Tonight, we have the pleasure of having Rich Trouton with us. He's a lead help desk technician at a major medical center in the Washington, D.C. area. He's also very, very well known for his speaking engagements at different Mac Tech conferences and Mac sysadmin conferences, and he lives in D.C., And welcome, Rich. We've been looking forward to having you join us this evening, so thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So could you tell us a little bit about, yourself, how you came to the Macintosh and how you ended up first writing this technical blog and sending out a lot of really generous posts, some of which have really gotten me out of jams. So we'd love to hear a little bit about how you got your start.
Well, I got my start at the University of Pittsburgh way back in the day. I think the first version of macOS that I worked with was, I think it was 7.5.2. And I got my start because the University of Pittsburgh needed student workers, and they weren't at the time, necessarily concerned with, how technically savvy you were. You were expected to sit behind the desk, grab the print output from the printer. If you could help people with questions, great. It was a great opportunity to just learn on the job. And one of the labs I worked with was in the engineering lab in Benedum Hall. And that was a great place to learn because they had one of everything. I mean, they had Unix workstations, they had PCs, they had Macs, they had all kinds of things. So and it was also in kind of an environment where you were expected to just, sink or swim. And fortunately, with the Macs, I was like, hey, this is great stuff. I want to just, keep doing it. I picked probably the wrong time to go into Mac IT because this was like the mid-'90s when everyone was like, no, don't go into Macs. And I was like, yeah, this is what I want to do. So, that's basically where I got my start.
So those were pretty difficult times. So you were working with things like phone net connectors and Farallon connectors, networking Macs, or what specifically?
I actually caught the wave of like the AAUI connectors,
okay,
with Ethernet and everything else. So I didn't run into PhoneNet until probably a little later down my career when I had the occasional stint as a contractor and I'd go into some environments and I'd go, what is this? And, I'd pull out like PhoneNet connectors and I'd be like, this is phone cord. How's this work?
But archaic, yeah.
Yeah. But, it's always cool to learn that kind of stuff. And at this point, I'm like, I have regrets that, along the way with my various moves, I've had to leave behind a lot of my more interesting antique Mac gear.
So then your progression from there was, were you an individual contractor? Were you doing Mac support?
I was doing Mac support after I graduated college, after a very brief stint teaching Windows, very, very brief. I started working for a marketing company in Philadelphia. Where I was their Mac guy. It was the kind of thing where I got brought on board, got told, okay, we've got artists, we've got writers. They're using Quark, they're using like Word 5.1. Some of our writers, even after Office 98 came around, you could not pry Word 5.1 from their hands. Actually had one guy who was like, I want Word 5.1. And then he said, I want to be able to open Word 98 documents in Word 5.1. And I had to explain to him, yeah, that doesn't work. So, yeah, that's where I got my start. Then I had a brief period, when marketing kind of went bad in the early 2000s. And eventually I wound up, after a brief stint of underemployment, working for the National Institutes of Health at the National Human Genome Research Institute, and that was a really cool job. I stayed there for about 8 years, and I learned a ton during that time. And in 2010, I decided it was time for a change, but I liked what I was doing. And fortunately, I found probably the one place, at least in the DC area, which would allow me to keep the parts of my job that I really liked and get rid of the parts of my job that I didn't like. And so I went to go work for the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, which is where I am now.
So what are the pieces of the job that you really wanted kind of to shed and move on from?
There's a lot of security rules in the federal government space, and rightfully so. But especially with the Macs, a lot of the requirements that I was given, they were written for Windows first, and we were told figure it out for the Mac side. And it was things like that. It's one of those things. A lot of those security requirements were absolutely needed, but it was one of those things where my scientists, they needed to get the job done. I had my security officers saying, we need to follow these rules. And sometimes it was tough to find that balance. And, there was always that stress of, I want to fight for my users at the same time. I got to follow these rules. So
It's so funny. It's so funny how you said figure it out for the Mac, because I hear that all the time. I'm sure we all do. It's like, all right, this is set up for this Windows environment, but figure it out for the Mac.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot. I remember the one time that I was told, I was given a requirement on, we need to enable Facebook for some of our public relations folks. And here's all the requirements you need to make this work. And it was basically this very locked down environment with special extra anti-malware tools and everything else. And I'm just looking at it. And of course, it was written for like Windows XP. And I was looking at it and I was like, well, wait, I could just do this whole thing in Windows. Let me ask if they're cool with, I think Parallels at the time was what I was using. And, I talked to our security officer and I talked to our various stakeholders in the matter, and they were like, yeah, sure, Windows. And the nice thing with that is that if they needed to get into, Facebook, they could by launching the VM and then getting into it that way. And that way, when they were done, they just shut down the VM and that extra layer just kind of went away. So it didn't really, hopefully it didn't impact the folks who needed to get on Facebook too much. So I thought that was a good balance to strike between the two.
So just to be clear, these were Mac users, and so you were able to avoid changing anything at all in the Mac users' workflow. You just kind of added to, for all intents and purposes, an app that happened to be a VM to run Facebook.
Correct. Yeah.
That's so cool.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that every so often we'd have that kind of thing where someone would say, I want to run a Mac simply because I want to not have to deal with some of the lockdowns on Windows. And usually we're like, okay.
Your blog goes all the way back to 2003. So, I mean, you're really quite prolific, and it's quite a body of work you have there. What sort of got you blogging, and what sort of keeps you motivated? I'm sure you get tons of really great feedback from guys like ourselves who, man, you really saved me. Thank you for what you do.
Probably what it is more than, I got started because, it was fun. More and more I blog because I have a bad memory. It's one of those things where I want to write things, if I run across something cool, I want to write it down so I remember it. And getting back to one of the things that I like about my current job is that they're pretty supportive of me doing that. They, back when I was with the government, there's always this, what can you write? What can't you write? This kind of thing. Howard Hughes is pretty supportive of that. So, it's one of those things that I feel it's been very freeing that I can just write what I want.
Well, I was going to say, so you started jotting these kind of notes almost for your own purposes down, and saw that it could be an additional benefit to other users like you, like other ACNs. So you started kind of posting it out there for everyone. I'm sure it caught fire pretty quickly.
Yeah, and it's that kind of thing where I've been writing these things down for myself along the way, but I was never sure when I was in the government space, what could I publish, what could I not publish? And, once again, going back to the security rules, there's some good reasons why you can't always publish what you're doing. And
it's very much like working for Apple, I would imagine.
Yeah, you have to be security conscious. You have to make sure that what you're doing isn't going to hurt anybody, isn't going to embarrass your employer or anything like that. And I just work in a different place now where they're pretty supportive, and so I don't have those concerns. And it's worked out, I think, in general for myself and the community.
Big time. I mean, it's so funny because the weakest part of a lot of people's games is the documentation part, but that seemed to be a big part of what you do. So I'm sure a lot of people appreciate that. I mean, I struggle sometimes to make sure I document every piece of information, but this is, I mean, I'm looking through a lot of the topics that you go through here, and it's just great stuff.
My friend and colleague, Tom Bridge, actually had a great thing that he said actually at the Penn State Mac conference last week, which was that I'm not writing this down so I can remember it later. I'm writing it down so I can remember right now. And, that's what it is a lot, that I'm just, I need to remember this, and I just write it down, and I take lots of screenshots, and because I know that eventually down the line, I'm my own best customer. I go back and I look at my own stuff and I go, how did I do this? Oh, right, because I wrote it down.
Do you ever find yourself going back and referencing it a lot? I mean, like, I know we do, but I mean, do you have your own notes internally, or do you go back to your own blog and kind of reference it from there?
I do both. I mean, I wrote it down, and the blog is searchable, and so it's like, what's this specific thing in FTE setup that I know I documented? I'll go look it up. I also have a code snippeting tool. I use CodeBox. So things that I don't necessarily think are appropriate to wind up on the blog or up on my GitHub repo, more often than not, they'll end up in like a private GitHub repo or in CodeBox, because it's easy to just copy and paste stuff in.
And in your day-to-day, how many Macs are you overseeing?
Roughly about 600 is my day-to-day.
Wow.
Do you have any support with that, or is it just you?
It's me and a colleague. And we also have over... Basically, we have two locations. One is our headquarters location, which actually has a separate help desk. But, that's kind of included in my count. At my location, it's me and a colleague. And like I said, at our location, we probably have about maybe 550.
Wow, that's really impressive. Yeah, that's very impressive. Now, so we might as well get into it a little bit deeper here. So among the Mac sysadmins and the Mac ACNs, you've come to be a file vault expert. Could you tell us a little bit, just generally speaking, how that came to pass? Is it just basically the school of hard knocks and you kind of reverse engineered everything that Apple did? Or were you, as much as you could share with us, were you brought in to do some development with them on this product?
Well, for this, we can thank Uncle Sam, actually. Back when I was at the NIH, my CIO, the institute that I worked for, we were given the job of figuring out Mac encryption. And my CIO pointed at me and said, basically, you're going to lead up the File Vault working group. Now, this is an original File Vault, legacy File Vault. Mm-hmm. And so I got to intimately know the strengths and weaknesses of legacy File Vault. And we actually wrote up a pretty good document, which you may be able to find somewhere on the NIH website to this day. But that's kind of where I caught the bug. And then in 2011, they announced that Apple is going to be doing whole disk encryption, or rather, it's like whole volume encryption. And I was like, this is fantastic. And I was at WWDC, and I went down and I talked to the security guys, and it was me and one other guy. I brought a list. I think the other guy had like 2 questions. And after he left, I was like, okay, I got this list. So I think I spent probably like the next 45 minutes just hitting them with questions. And I wrote it up and posted it on the dev forums. And that's pretty much where it started. Was it just happened to be I was in the right place at the right time with the right list of questions. And it's kind of gone from there.
And before that, were you using with your machines when you needed to use it PGP, or were you actually struggling through with the original File Vault?
I was using PGP,
right.
And that was fine up until I think 10.6.7 when we started hitting those problems with PGP, where Apple was replacing basically the combo updates. And after 10.6.7 started knocking out the boot EF5 file that PGP was relying on for its own pre-boot login screen.
That's right, and then it wouldn't boot once you
Right.
did the combo update. Yep.
Right, and the first time that happened, I actually remember because I think I just started at my current job, and so I still had a lot of contacts at the NIH. And I went upstairs. I was at a conference. I went to Dell Case's Case conference in 2010, and because a colleague of mine who was supposed to go couldn't make it, and we already had the ticket, and I had just gone to MacTech 2010, which was in Los Angeles, and the Case conference was in San Francisco. So my boss was basically like, "Well, you're on the correct coast anyway. Would you mind just going?" I was like, "Okay, sure." And I ran into some folks that I knew at the NIH, and I knew one of them in particular. They had standardized pretty much on PGP across the board. Mm-hmm. So I think it was one of the breaks, I went up to my room. 10.6.7 had just come out, so I updated my laptop. And then PGP, immediately I couldn't get into PGP. I was like, oh no, this is a problem. And then I was like, oh no, it's an even bigger problem for other people. I got to warn them. So I ran downstairs. I found this other institute's CIO who was also attending the conference, because these were the folks that had pretty much standardized on PGP. I was like, there's a big problem with Mac PGP. Don't update. He told me later that apparently he had called his director, and his director had been just about to open software update to grab the new combo update.
Wow.
So,
That's a close call.
Yeah, when the CIO called him, was like, no.
All the stars aligned perfectly at that moment. Yeah, that's great.
The diving save.
Yep. So when Apple announced FileVault 2, I was like, wait, that means it probably won't break like that. That's fantastic.
One would hope.
I mean, there were so many inherent problems with the original FileVault, and we should we could do a whole show about that. So, how did you, once FileVault 2 was released, how did you become, one of the go-to people in our community for basically just banging on it hard enough and reverse engineering it?
I think just a lot of testing. I wrote, actually at that conference, I was talking with my colleague Ed Marzak, who's the editor for MacTech Magazine, and he'd been after me for a little bit to write another article. I'd written one probably about 2008 about encryption, and he wanted to see if I could do another one. I said, I have this great topic. Let me write about FileVault 2, which at this time was still covered under NDA. He was like, absolutely, go do it. So I wrote it up. I did a ton of testing. And that's pretty much been it. It's just been me plugging away at testing in virtual machines. So, that's a lot of it is just testing and paying attention to what the man page is and everything else.
And do you have anybody internally that you can reach out to if you really get stumped with something, or is it pretty much a brick wall?
Outside of WWDC, when
Cough I can talk, once for yes.
I'll just say that outside of WWDC, I don't have a lot of contact with Apple's engineers. Mm-hmm. I have heard that Apple does use my stuff, which is fine by me, But yeah, I don't. This isn't one of those things where Apple is slipping me anything under the table.
No. I wasn't thinking that at all. But
yeah,
it's always
that's kind of cool to know that Apple is, referencing your information. So you're saying some of the documentation that you provide or whatever is being referenced possibly by Apple?
That's what I hear. It's not something official. It's more along the lines of like when people will go to client sites, they'll say, hey, you should check out this blog, or that kind of thing. Nothing. I'm not included in any of Apple's training materials that I'm aware of. But that kind of thing. If you want more information, here's a good place to look. And it's always been very, very unofficial. Very, I hear from a friend of a friend.
Yeah, gotcha. Well, I was just thinking in my head. I was like, wait a second, because I teach some of the classes. I'm like, is your stuff in any of the training materials? But
To the best of my knowledge,
you're right. There's nothing. Yeah, that's very cool, man. I mean, the Firewall 2 is obviously a big. It can be a big win for a lot of people that have struggled with the security aspect of things and going third party. So, to have this much documentation and talk about a lot of the command line capabilities that you mentioned is very big for a lot of the admins that have to dive deep into this.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where, especially for encryption vendors, more and more they're going to be using Firewall 2 instead of architecting their own solutions. I've already seen that with McAfee. They've started doing what they call, management of native encryption, where they're managing like BitLocker and Firewall 2. I think Sophos Safeguard recently has started managing Firewall 2, and people that offer MDM solutions for the Mac. They can leverage the Firewall 2 profiles that were introduced with Mavericks. So it's that kind of thing where more and more you're seeing vendors drop their own third-party encryption solutions in favor of using Firewall 2 and using Apple's FD setup management tool, which is one of those things that's nice because then you just have to learn how FD setup operates, and you can pretty much understand the limits, the strengths and weaknesses of a lot of vendors' solutions.
And of course, that was your topic that you presented at the most recent Mac Tech conference in Pittsburgh, right?
State College, PA, yes, on FD setup and Mavericks. It's changed a little bit. Like when they first introduced it in Mountain Lion, the capabilities of the two have changed. Not big changes, but little things. And then a lot of the little gotchas are the things that I wind up will make it into a post on my blog. Like for example, in 10.8, any admin user could enable folks for Firewall 2, and in 10.9, Apple said nope, only enabled users or using like the Firewall 2 personal recovery key, that alphanumeric recovery key. You'll be able to use those for authentication, but just regular admin users won't be able to enable other accounts for Firewall 2 anymore. So that's a difference between 10.8 and 10.9. And we'll probably see additional changes as the tool evolves in 10.10, but we'll just have to see.
And for people who are listening who are interested in reading more about Rich's presentation through his blog, which we'll provide the links to it in the show notes, you can get Rich's. He was very generous to provide his slides, so you could review them and review his presentation.
Yeah, one thing I like to do as part of my slides is include everything that I'm talking about, specifically so that people who don't get the chance to attend my talks can watch the videos, can get the slides, and hopefully, get as good an experience, get the information that they need to from them, even though they didn't actually attend.
Now, I think you do a good job of wording it, and I was looking through it a little earlier, just talking about the bouncer standing by the door and not allowing you to come in and stuff. And I think the wording that you use is actually pretty good, even though we're all technical, that it can help kind of bring it down to some terminology that we may understand a little easier. Because you could be a very well-versed ACN or technician, but you're not well-versed in this particular topic. And I think the way you describe it is excellent for a lot of us. So well done.
Thank you.
I'm trying to think of the question I had before I was so rudely interrupted by Jerry. What was that? Internally. Sorry, Jerry. Internally, so you guys are using Casper at your solution, right?
Correct.
And do you find yourself scripting a lot with FileVault 2 or utilizing the profiles given within Casper, or a little bit of both?
I'd really prefer not to go into that. You understand?
Okay, no problem.
I mean, I do like Casper. Yeah, it's one of those things where my shop doesn't have a lot of security rules, but I would, there are certain things I just don't feel comfortable discussing.
So some of that is probably your intellectual property, and there's some stuff you want to part with and some stuff you don't want to, and we respect that. So,
well, not only that, but you probably don't want to reveal too much about the inner workings, to outsiders, just for security itself.
Yeah, it's definitely less intellectual property, more it's our stuff,
Mm-hmm.
enough said. I got you, man.
So Alan is asking in the chat, or actually he sort of mentions that FDE setup is great, but it doesn't exist in 10.7. So did you do much work sort of poking around with File Vault 2 in 10.7?
Yeah, I did. And Google actually came out with an interesting tool that they introduced as part of their first File Vault solution, Cauliflower Vest.
Yeah, I remember.
But what they did was they actually wrote their own command line tool, CSFDE. And it was basically their core storage full disk encryption tool. And it was the kind of thing that would allow you to, it was a Google built tool, which is, open source. You can use it. I think it also works after 10.7, but it was primarily written for 10.7, where you could feed in essentially the information needed to encrypt a machine and enable one account. And previous to that, there really was no way to encrypt from the command line. So for me, this was a big thing on 10.7.
Being able to automate that and push that out to a bunch of machines all at once and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, you still had to do some work. There was no deferred enablement like you have with File Vault 2, but it was the kind of thing that Google had built a client that popped up over the login window, and you could then to essentially enforce File Vault 2 encryption because it popped up before the user had the chance to log in and force them to encrypt their machine. So it's pretty cool. And there's a few tools that still use that model to this day, where they've got something that pops up over the login screen before the user logs in, and makes them initialize encryption. Then it automatically restarts, and it's nice because then you don't have to really work with. It's a much more self-service model for your users. Oh, okay, I have to do this now. I'm encrypted. Moving on.
So is that the kind of thing that these other vendors, these third-party vendors, are, sort of adding or bringing value to the first-party solution of, say, File Vault 2, requiring machines, I guess, using profiles to have File Vault enabled, and I guess disallowing users from turning it off and that kind of thing?
Right, and the other thing where they bring value added is that it allows essentially common storage of File Vault 2 recovery keys. For example, if you want to use a solution that uses the alphanumeric personal recovery key, that's something that Apple really only provides one place to store with, and that's with them. If you're a consumer, these solutions would allow you to essentially store with your solution, which would be hosted in-house, which is nice. Dell's solution was actually pretty interesting. It used to be Credence. Before Dell bought Credent, but they had an interesting approach, which was they took the institutional key, which is the File Vault master keychain, because that's normally a shared key. But what they decided to do was implement that, but with a unique key for every machine. And every other solution that I've seen does the individual recovery key for that, or the personal recovery key, but they decided to use the institutional key. And I was like, okay, that's perfectly valid. That's cool. It's not the approach I expected, but it also works.
So you're saying, can you actually go through that again? So you're saying it uses a unique key or a key that would be institutional across the board?
What they did was they took the institutional key, which was the
File Vault master keychain, right?
Yeah, exactly. Which is usually designed to be, I'll build it once and then I'll put it on a whole bunch of machines. Right. But what they did was they took that concept and they said, okay, we're going to build one for each machine.
Oh, okay.
So, I mean, it's one of those things I was like, that's interesting. I haven't seen someone do that because, normally it's more trouble, but they automated it. I was like, okay, cool.
So then in effect, because I've heard this question from somebody, and basically if someone did get locked out and you gave them let's say they were over the phone or something like that, and the technician had to give them the recovery key, then that would technically be something they'd know for all the other devices, right? Unless...
For the institutional recovery key, that's not something you can really give over the phone because that requires an actual – it's like SSL where you need that public and private key working in combination to unlock the encryption. So normally for SSL, the private key is stored on the remote server's end, and the public key is what gets sent out over the network. So you still, for the institutional key, you need that public and private key to work together. So it would be an actual file that you'd need to send to the user.
Oh, okay.
And,
I was thinking of something else. My bad.
Yeah, the thing that you would send to someone would be the alphanumeric personal recovery key.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, and you can do that. And actually 10.9 makes that, because it used to be on like 10.7 and 10.8. In order to change that key, you'd have to decrypt the machine and then re-encrypt it, which can be a bit of a hassle. So especially if someone's like, going to be remote for a while, you didn't really have a good opportunity to say, okay, I'm giving you this key over the phone. Would you mind just forgetting you ever heard about it? But with 10.9, they actually have, as part of FD, set up what's called the change recovery function, which essentially will rotate out both a personal recovery key and just replace it with a new one, and also an institutional key. So in the event that your recovery key or recovery keys got out in the wild, you could, without decrypting your machines now on 10.9, you can actually rotate those out and make sure that that particular breach is sealed, which is nice.
Sweet.
Yeah, it's extremely powerful.
Yep.
And with what previews you've seen of the coming 10.10, is there anything that's that you're really looking forward to that's coming out with Yosemite, that in particular with the File Vault 2?
What I see, I like. But beyond that, I'm not really, I'm not really willing to go on the record quite yet. Watch for my blog post after Yosemite comes out. As far as what, I haven't seen anything in Yosemite that makes me shake my head and wish for the good old days of Mountain Lion or anything like that. So I like what I see.
Rich, when did you do your first public speaking engagement, particularly on the topic of File Vault 2? Or was that, in fact, your first foray into public speaking? Because I must say that I've watched your presentations from Sweden in particular, and you've got a real great gift for speaking in front of people, and I was just wondering how you developed those chops.
Thank you. Well, my first speaking engagement was actually at the Penn State Macamins 2011. Penn State Macamins is a great place to start out as a first-time speaker. The audiences are good. Generally they want you to succeed. Penn State's very supportive. And that was actually about modular imaging and deployment, where, breaking away from the model of, let's build this perfect machine, get all of our stuff on it, and then pull a disk image from it. And more towards, let's just, our image should just have like the OS on it, and everything else gets installed after the fact. Mm-hmm. So that was actually my first talk. And it's also where I started my tradition at Penn State of bringing candy for my audience. Because
what
my
kind
thought
of candy?
was, I think if I remember correctly, it was like a mix of like chocolates and M&Ms and Snickers and like the fun sizes, the fun size bags.
Yeah,
sure.
And I figured, if nothing else, I could make my audience perhaps like me just for the fact that I brought candy.
You're bribing them.
Yeah. But my talk, I think, also went pretty well, and I made some good friends at that conference. And that actually, the next speaking engagement is probably the first one I spoke about File Vault 2, and that was for MacTech 2011 that same year. And that's where I gave my initial talk on File Vault 2 on 10.7.
I keep hearing about the Mac sysadmin conference, and I keep saying I'm going to go. I got to go next year. It's an annual one, right?
Yes.
At Penn State? Yeah, I hear, obviously you're a speaker there, so, but I hear a lot of great things about the speakers and the topics covered, and it's not too far from us. It's just, next year I definitely got to jump on board for that.
Yeah, it's definitely a great conference. It's also pretty affordable for folks on the East Coast. At least if you're like north of, say, North Carolina, though we also have participants coming from North Carolina, it's not that bad of a drive. So say you're coming from New York, Ohio, Tennessee, you're within a day's driving distance easily. Like I can drive up and it's like 3.5 hours from Northern Virginia, where I'm starting from. So, and they do a great job.
How many days is that conference?
This year it was Tuesday through Friday. The actual start of the conference was Wednesday, but they also had pre-conference workshops, which I was there for. So yeah, it's all told it was a 4-day conference. I got there on Monday night and came home Friday afternoon.
And your work is pretty good about having you take the time to deliver speeches at these conferences.
Yeah, my work is very supportive, and I'm very grateful for that.
No, that's pretty great. I mean, you got to be away a week at a clip, and I mean, that's a big deal. But they also know that you're well versed in these topics, so they know that you're someone they want to keep on board.
Yeah, like I said, I have a great employer, and I'm very lucky that they see the value in what I do. Right. And that, not just my speaking, but also in my writing as well. So I'm very lucky.
Well, you should be proud. I mean, tonight we have a pretty decent-sized crowd on the chat, so that definitely shows that there's a lot of interest in you coming on our show and talking. So that's pretty awesome, man. You brought in the crowds, Rich.
Wow.
Rich, can you share with us just some general tips, perhaps when deploying these? Not necessarily deploying a group of file vault machines, but let's say a lot of our listeners are guys who are in the trench every day, ACNs, small to medium-sized businesses that they're dealing with. Do you have a general way that you sort of go about addressing a machine when you want to do file vault to encryption on it, or is it pretty much press the button and just let it go?
It's one of those things that you have to you really have to carefully evaluate what your needs are. Like, there are going to be some environments where everybody's got to be encrypted, from the get-go. It comes out of the box, it's got to be encrypted. IT is going to be enabling the encryption, then working with the users to enable their own accounts. There's going to be other shops where, they pull it out of the box. They then need to put it into another box and ship it off to somebody. There's going to be shops where, they don't even see the box. What happens is that they get a user calling in who says, "Hey, I need to go to this website, download the management agent, and then I need you guys to walk me through over the phone how to encrypt my machine." Then there's going to be environments where it's going to be up to the users whether or not they want to encrypt. There's some shops where it's like, we leave it up to you, figure it out. So, for shops that, for example, you don't know necessarily who's going to be turning on encryption and who isn't. A good choice for that might be the building and using an institutional recovery key, because then you can put that in place on the machines, and it'll be there waiting for whenever the user decides to turn on encryption, if they do. Because in that case, if they bring it back to you, it might be the kind of thing where they'll just be sitting in a hotel room and go, "Oh, well, maybe I should encrypt my machine." Then they go into the file vault preference pane, turn it on, and that way your recovery key is set up and just waiting for them. And then 6 months later, when they come back in, they're like, "Everything's all broke, everything's all encrypted, I need you to get my stuff out." At that point, you go to your safe, you pull out the recovery key, and you can recover their stuff. Mm-hmm. If you have a solution where everything is like locked down and for security reasons you can't have any shared recovery key whatsoever, you'll need to have a secure key escrow service that when the machine encrypts, it will send along that personal recovery key for that machine to your key escrow service, and it always has to work. So it really does depend. I mean, I've had people say, I've had all kinds of things, and the one thing that I've found in common is that everybody does things a little different.
And the best piece of documentation to deploy an institutional recovery key that's sitting on the machine would be from your website?
From my website, Apple also has a pretty good document on that. I don't remember the KBase number right off the top of my head, but they also have a good knowledge base document on how to set up a personal recovery key.
I have that somewhere. I'll get it for you guys.
Yeah. And also the security tool, the command line security tool, includes a create file vault master keychain function, which will create a recovery key that you can it's not quite done yet, because it'll create the recovery key. But what you need to do after that is actually make a copy of that complete key, because that has both your public and private keys in it at that point. Make a copy of that, store that somewhere safe, and then take that key that you have and yank out the public key. Yank out the private key. You want to have only the public key inside. And once you have that keychain with only the public key inside, then you can put that on your machines and use that for encryption. Because if the Mac sees that you're using a File Vault Master keychain that has both the public and private keys inside, it's going to assume that this is actually like a leftover from, say, 10.6 or something like that, where Legacy File Vault allowed the use of having a File Vault Master keychain that had both the public and private key inside. So if you're using a File Vault Master keychain and you go to encrypt and it pops up and says, hey, here's this alphanumeric string, and do you want to store the recovery key with Apple? Double check that recovery key because it's not set up properly.
It's good to know. Just an additional question about the escrow services. Are there any that you in particular recommend for storage of the recovery keys?
There's a variety of them out there, and like I said, it really depends on what your needs are. There are some shops that want to use a cross-platform recovery key service where you're managing both your Windows and Mac machines with the same solution. A good example of that, I think, is McAfee's solution for managing native encryption, because that'll handle BitLocker as well. There are other solutions where you're just going to be managing just Macs. There's some good open source solutions out there. Crypt by Graham Gilbert is a good example of that, where he basically wrote his own solution. He looked at Google's Cauliflower Vest, which is hosted on Google App Engine, and he was like, I love the idea, but I can't have it on Google App Engine because, well, my clients need to have this in-house. So he actually wrote Crypt to give those shops a in-house solution for storing their recovery keys. There's all sorts of solutions. So just it's my usual piece of advice is figure out what you need, take a look at the solutions that fit those needs, and then use the one that works best for you.
No, that's a good overall answer. I mean, and there are those different situations, like you said, if you're allowed to store it externally, if you're not, and have to take all those things into account before you decide on a solution. So that makes total sense.
Yeah, it's one of those things where so much of this really revolves around what's your requirements and what's your trust level. Because there are some shops that are like, okay, I have no problem with putting this on Google App Engine. Right. There are other shops that are like, I can't have a cloud solution in play at all. And you got to figure out what your requirements are first. And once you do that, narrowing down the solution is pretty simple, or it can be.
Right. I have just one additional question. At the conferences or when you do speaking engagements, do you tend to get a lot of questions about people with network accounts and concerns with File Vault 2, or just because you have to have a local home for this to work, right? So
that's correct.
Do you tend to get a lot of questions from, let's say, people integrating with Active Directory or anything like that, where they can't get File Vault 2 to work properly with their network accounts?
Yeah, I've gotten that. And the way File Vault 2 works, it'll work with your local accounts, or it'll work with mobile network accounts. So anything that can cache your credentials. So, Open LDAP, Open Directory, Active Directory. As long as it can cache those credentials and it has a local home, File Vault 2 should work with it. The main thing there is going to be changing your password outside the machine. So say you're working with AD and for whatever reason you can't change your password directly on the machine. Help desk has to reset it for you at some point or something. File Vault's usually pretty good about that, because what happens is that so say your password changes when you're off your work network. If you come back in and hook back up to your work network via Ethernet, or if you've got the right sort of Wi-Fi setup where you can connect back to your AD domain controllers via your Wi-Fi at the login window, what you can do is bring your machine in, start it up. You'll log in at the File Vault 2 login screen. At the File Vault 2 login window, you'll log in first with your old password, and then when it goes through the login process and the OS comes up, it'll check in with that directory service and say, "Oh, password changed. Okay, let me stop you at the OS login window. And at that point, you log in with your new password, and that password change then gets fed back to FileVault 2. So the next time you reboot your machine and log in at the FileVault 2 pre-boot login screen, it'll have that new password. That's the way it's supposed to work anyway. I've heard from people saying, I've run into situations where it doesn't work that way. What do I do? I'm like, usually my advice at that point is something's gone wrong. I would recommend decrypt the machine and then re-encrypt it just to get that sync process working properly again.
I'm sure you get that a lot where like you give an explanation like, well, I tried that already. I can't get it to work. Well, it's like, I can't see your environment. So it's really hard for me to.
I can't see your screen from here. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's tough. I'm sure you get a ton of that as people come up to you after the conferences.
And your entire installed base at work, Rich, they're all using FileVault at this point, and you've found it to be pretty rock solid?
Once again, this gets into our operational stuff. I'd prefer not to comment on that. I will say that I found FileVault 2 to be pretty reliable.
Okay.
Way to go, Jerry.
The probing questions.
Hey, I have just a general question for you that I've been wondering about. Where did you come up with the name for your blog?
You know, someone was asking me about that just today. It is, in fact, a family joke, which may not make sense outside my family. And I told the person, because they were like, to settle a bet, what's it mean? And I said, you know what? The day Jamf explains what Jamf means, what it really means, the day after that, I'll tell everyone what, Der Flounder is all about. So...
so we're going to wait forever.
Hey, you never know. Jamf might hear this and go, you know what? We really want to find out what Der Flounder is all about.
They'll take it as a personal challenge. That would be cool because I'm dying to know what Jamf means too. So
this has been really informative, Rich. Thanks for and for the record, I'm still here. I've been pretty quiet on this conversation, but I'm absorbing it all, and I think this is a great topic and really, really interesting. So thank you, Rich, for joining us. One question did pop into my mind. Just do backups come into play at all? I mean, I imagine maybe backups are managed. I'm thinking, of course, of just Time Machine, but there may be other solutions that are in place. And of course, with Time Machine, the only concern, I guess, with regards to encryption would be on any kind of external drives. But do you get involved in that at all?
Yeah, I would actually say that if you're planning an encryption project, the other thing that you should be standing up, if you don't already have one, is a backup project, because encryption is designed to keep people out. And in the event that you hit a situation where you can't get in anymore, none of the keys work, your password doesn't work, the recovery key for whatever reason isn't working, the drive's just not letting you in, backups turn that from a disaster into an inconvenience. And you know what? I will take an inconvenience over a disaster any day.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's for sure. I'm always this question comes up when I'm just turning on a good old-fashioned Time Machine backup for, a one-off client on an external hard drive, and they may be traveling with it. And of course, it's ideally, we would encrypt the backup drive, and they're using FileVault on the internal drive. But what if something goes wrong with the backup and we don't realize it soon enough? Right. And then they lose the machine or something like that. And, it's one thing to try and recover data from unencrypted volume, but yeah, to try and have to, recover data from an encrypted volume is a whole different story, or just basically impossible. So, so that's always a question. It's like, do you want your backup to be like as accessible as possible, or do you want it to be like as secure as possible? And if you choose the latter, you better be storing these keys outside of your machine for, as much as possible, print them out, put them in a safe, that kind of thing.
Right. And actually for that kind of situation, if people ask me, I usually recommend a backup drive that uses hardware encryption, where it's not necessarily using something that pops up on your screen to say put in a password. Instead, the kind of thing where you plug in the drive and then you have to enter a PIN code into a keypad that's on top of the drive, or that uses some sort of biometric authentication to unlock the drive. And the reason for that is that, for one thing, you can leverage some pretty industrial grade encryption that way. And for another thing, it makes it a little easier to work with various OSs that way, because you've taken that encryption layer, and you've moved it off to a separate piece of hardware. And that separate piece of hardware handles all the encryption for you from your Mac or even your PC's perspective. It's just another drive that's hooked up. So that's my usual recommendation for things like that. It's pricey, or it can be. Depends on how strong of encryption you want to go. But to my mind, the saved hassle, assuming you have the budget for it, the saved hassle is worth it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good recommendation.
And do you have a manufacturer that you have worked with in the past that for these external drives that you particularly favor?
One that I've worked with in the past that worked well for me, though I don't want this to sound like an endorsement, was MXI Securities.
Okay.
They actually did, back when I worked at the NIH, they did some legwork to make their product work well with Macs. I think they got bought by IronKey later, but those were good drives. There were also,
because I mean the most visible one, of course, is IronKey, and I was just wondering if you've had some repeated experiences with that product.
I've had some experience with that. With MXI Security stuff, which is now I think owned by IronKey,
right?
And but in general, I'd say do your homework. Once again, figure out what your security requirements are, and just kind of go from there. Because it may be one of those things that, especially for a government or healthcare institution, you have specific regulations about your encryption. It must be this certain strength. It must meet these certain requirements. So that's one of those things where, to go along with your encryption, it's one of those things that you'd think, we just turn on encryption, it's easy, but not easy, but straightforward. But there's a lot of, depending on the industry you're in, there could be a lot of rules that actually govern this kind of thing that you need to be mindful of for when the auditors come in and say, well, show me what you've done. So
certainly, and I've never heard this sort of two-pronged approach where you deal with encryption outside of the machine with a completely separate piece of hardware, and I like that. I like that with solution.
Yeah, to my way of thinking, it saves you on hassle, and it also means that your backups are encrypted from your machine and then also onto the backup solution, so they never get outside the point where they're unencrypted, except for maybe the USB or Thunderbolt cable that connects the two.
Yeah, and you've also got essentially two modes of failure, two distinct modes of failure, so that you don't have a software issue affecting both the file vault encrypted startup disk as well as the backup drive. Obviously it's not. It's not necessarily the same software handling it, but by having a hardware unit for the external, for the backup drive in that case, totally different, sort of workflow. So just subject to different problems, and hopefully one works where the other doesn't.
That's right. Right. Yeah, and they're affordable. The IronKey products generally are pretty affordable and pretty nice products to present to a client.
Yeah.
So, Rich, just generally speaking, where do you see, because you've got a lot of involvement in just security in general, specifically with encryption, and File Vault too. But where do you see security going in the next, 2 to 5 years? I mean, do you see a lot more of this hardware encryption? Obviously, we've got Touch ID now. Do you see that maybe coming to the Mac at all?
I don't know. It's one of those things where I'm terrible at predicting the future. I do think that more and more folks are recognizing that this kind of protection is not. It's not a bonus. It's necessary. Where, if someone steals your phone, they may be stealing not just your text messages anymore. They may be stealing your, the other end of your two-factor authentication solution. Potentially sensitive documents. In the case of if you've got stuff stored from Dropbox. I think that we're going to see more and more that the encryption is going to become more ubiquitous, but at the same time, I think it's actually going to become more invisible, where maybe one day you don't even necessarily have to go through an encryption process. You just get your machine. It's going to include, as part of this setup assistant, that a little checkbox that says, do you want to turn on encryption? You hit it, and your hard drive just turns on the hardware encryption module. And it's just done. Yeah. I think, because that's where we're pretty much with iOS devices. As soon as you enable the passcode, encryption just flips on.
Right.
And I think that's what we're going to be seeing. And not just in the Apple world. I think we're going to be starting to see that other places as well. And it'll just be one of those things that maybe 50 years from now, maybe sooner, it's going to be, oh no, I've lost my thing. Okay. It's not a big deal. Because what you've lost is essentially your safe, and the safe that no one can break into. And as long as you have your backup of what was in the safe, once again, you've turned disaster into inconvenience. All you've lost seemingly is your empty wallet, but you still have all your money.
Yeah, I totally agree with the trend of sort of removing a layer of abstraction, or just opting the user in a lot of cases, because why is this a question for the end user? Do you want to be secure? I mean, we recommend it. It's like just do it, and make it so that it's easy to use and transparent to the user, because they're sort of, I think a lot of users are still not educated well enough to make these decisions. A lot of it is going to come down to educating the user about what they really actually need to worry about. I've dealt with users who swear they'll never buy, they don't want the iPhone 5S, or they don't want to enable Touch ID because then their fingerprint is out there, they think. But they don't realize that it's a much bigger concern that they don't have a passcode, of any sort. Right. So, it's like just about kind of like helping a user navigate that. But I think as time goes on, they'll be a little bit, they'll get it. And I think vendors will start to make the better decisions just to, hopefully improve the security of everything for the users without requiring so much user intervention.
Yeah, I agree. Actually, a couple WWDCs ago, I was at a session where the Apple presenter was speaking. He's basically like, we're just going to try to do the right thing. Like when you're crashing in your car, a little button in a little window does not appear going, you appear to be entering a car accident. Do you want to deploy the airbag?
Right.
Yes, no. No, your airbag just deploys. So that's the kind of model that I think Apple's going to be going towards, where if it can tell disaster's coming, it's going to do what makes sense. It's not going to prompt the user to say, oh, disaster incoming. What do you want me to do? The user's going to go, I don't know. Here, let me press buttons. It's just going to do the right thing.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And using iOS, especially the iPhone, as kind of a leading indicator for that is probably smart, because that is where Apple tends to, they certainly have the widest kind of exposure there as far as the user base. And, we can see that they've already begun to do that. They addressed that specifically in the keynote, I think, announcing the iPhone 5S, saying that, a really scary number of users just don't have a passcode. And, so we've made it more convenient and just basically made encryption like I think it's almost opt-in. It kind of walks you through the process when you set one up, right?
Yeah. And like I said, as soon as that passcode's enabled, boom, encryption's on. Didn't even have to think about it.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's the dream for all of us, security conscious consultants. One more question for you from Luis in the chat. He says, question for Rich. What is on your wish list of processes or functionality that you feel would make your day-to-day, easier? Is there anything missing?
I guess more automation. I manage a lot of Macs, so the more I can automate, the better my job is. And actually, as far as that goes, I do want to plug, there is a open source project called AutoPackage that has made my life a lot easier by what it is, it's an open source tool that works with recipe files. And these recipe files are basically, they store information about a particular software package, like, for example, Skype. And what it does is when you use AutoPackage and reference the Skype recipe, so you say AutoPackage run Skype .pkg as the recipe, what it'll do is it'll go and contact the portion of the Skype website that has a link for downloading the latest version of the software. and it'll gather that latest version of the software and package it up for me so that I can just put it into Casper, or I can just put it into my Deploy Studio workflow. And you can since it's a command line tool, you can automate it to run every so often. So, for example, you could have it set up for to run every so often, and then once its run has completed, send you an email to say, hey, I downloaded this stuff. There's something new available. I've downloaded it for you, and come get it when you're ready.
So you can keep your packages up to date, basically.
Exactly. And if you're using one of the some of the folks who are most involved in AutoPackage are also involved with Monkey, which is an open source software updating tool. And you can some of the AutoPackage recipes specifically for Monkey will then once AutoPackage downloads the software, it'll then move it into your Monkey repository. So now it's even less work for you because it's already in your Monkey repository. All you have to do is then, assign it to test machines, see if it works, and then reassign it to your production machines. And all you really had to do was just reassign, which is beautiful. I wish more software vendors would include that kind of capability, because right now, I have to then go get the packages and then, in my case, put it into Casper admin. There are Casper recipes that I'm still I'm still working on to see how I can integrate them best into my workflow. But that kind of thing where I wish more software vendors would take advantage of that kind of functionality, where it's just, oh, okay, maybe it's not from Microsoft, maybe it's not from Apple, but this ability to grab updates from anywhere, any software vendor that allows me to download over the internet, let me go grab those, let me put them into my software repository to make it easier for those, my administrators to just go, oh, okay, I have this up, it's ready to go, I've tested it on my test machines, let me click this button and get it rolled out to my users.
Right, because it kind of seems like the alternative is everyone who needs a workflow like this ends up kind of figuring out or, looking online to see how to package a specific, update or an installer, reinventing the wheel each time. So the idea is that I guess they kind of have that recipe that just the software can reference to make it work, basically. Is that the idea?
Yeah, and a lot of recipes are posted. The site for this is github.com/AUTOPKG. And they have a lot of recipes posted there where people have written them and shared them back to the AutoPackage project so that, you can just take a look and go, oh, I need that software. Let me go grab that recipe from GitHub. And when GitHub gets updated, you can have AutoPackage just update its own copy of the recipes from that GitHub repository, and now you have the latest as well. It's a very community-focused tool where the community is writing the recipes, and it's the kind of thing where, oh, I've done this, let me share it back to make your life easier. Which is it's one of those great things about the Mac community that I found. It's a community that likes to share this kind of thing.
Yeah, that's something we've revisited multiple times on the show, and it's definitely something that bears out in practice. And it's great when an author will go even to the lengths of or a team of authors creating basically enabling the community to do that more even more easily and share that knowledge. So that's a great recommendation. And in fact, it looks like you have a great little overview on your blog as well. So recommend all the listeners check that out.
Well, this has been great, Rich. We really thank you. You've been very generous with your time and generous for many, many years with the extended Mac community. So we thank you for everything you do and spending a little bit of time with us. This has been great.
Thank you for having me on.
And why don't you give out your Twitter handle so we could find you on Twitter, and we'll include all your contact details in our show notes. Okay.
Yeah, it's I'm on Twitter at RTROUTON, so that's at RTrouton. That's my primary social media thing. And my website can also be reached at dearflounder.wordpress.com.
And you're very, very accessible, and you're very, very kind in answering emails. And I'm sure you're not going to get a flood of them, but if people needed to reach out to you, I'm sure they could.
Yeah, and if people want to reach me that way, it is rtrouton@gmail.com.
Excellent. Thanks again, Rich. This has been great.
Jerry does his voices of customers of all kinds.
Am I on the cloud?
Joe spins his deeply detailed yarns all the time.
I have a whole story about this.
Sam is on the road again, phoning in from a hotel.
At least we know where I am.
Half a century combined of Apple expertise right now. Right now. My Mac is slow